Okay, so welcome to this stream. So I'm hoping everything is working correctly because it's been a while since I've done one of these and I'm using a different software. So welcome everyone. I'm going to be joined in a second by George Martin, who I'm sure needs no introduction. But what we're going to be doing is, in fact, actually, you know what? I don't know why I don't just have you now. So I'll just bring you on now. I'm sure everyone knows George, also known as Carnism Debunked. And you recently had on David Benatar to your podcast, the Carnism Debunked podcast. Do you just want to give a brief over? Because obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, what we're going to do is we're basically just going to watch it back together and share our thoughts as we go along. So do you want to give a brief intro to what you discussed there? And then I'll say some stuff and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, sure. So I really wanted to pick Benatar's brains on this because the very kind of obvious arguments going around the animal rights movement, certainly over the years that I've been in the animal rights movement, is that, you know, procreation is a moral bad. And yeah, while a lot of vegans do have kids and are natalists, they tend to make quite admittedly self-serving arguments for having kids, and it's just like, yeah, you know, I understand the impact this could have, however I'll try to raise my kids vegan, blah blah blah. However, more recently some arguments have been going around vegan circles that for altruistic reasons it's actually better to not be an anti-natalist, and that anti-natalism could in fact harm animals in the long run because you know, we'll go into this in the podcast, but humans clear the most land space. We're the only species whose existence around could actually have the technology to mitigate wild animal suffering. If we go, wild animal suffering will just continue, all this kind of stuff. So I thought, who better to ask all these, put these arguments to than Lord Benatar himself. So I managed to get him on the podcast, and it was... yeah, I think it will be good to go over it today with Lawrence with a bit of a tooth comb and do a bit of running commentary on it and maybe add some stuff to that.
Yeah, so yeah, just to bounce off what you said. So to be honest, I was anti-natalist and didn't talk about it for quite a long time in the animal rights movement, just because I don't know, I was just more focused on animal rights stuff, to be honest. And it just wasn't, even though I was an anti-natalist, it wasn't at the forefront of my mind to bring it up here, there and everywhere. And then obviously I've become more involved in it, obviously, since doing this channel and stuff. So I sort of have discussed it more in animal rights circles, and I agree with you. I would say, out of every time I've brought up the topic in an animal rights circle, people generally have more sympathy towards it than not. Yes. And yeah, it's for the reasons that you were saying before. A lot of people say, oh yeah, I understand, I wouldn't want to, you know, create someone and them not be vegan, because, you know, like, the way they would frame it is, I'm trying to help animals, and if I create someone and they're not vegan, well, they've just undone everything I'm trying to do and more, because they're probably killing even more animals than I'm going to be able to save or spare, or however you want to phrase it. But yeah, as you're saying, it comes more from this new one about you know, wild animals, and there's also a few others that we can go over. Seems to come more from, I've seen it come more from the debate bro sort of philosophy bro aspects of veganism, very much sort of in the depths of Discord servers and stuff like that. Which I'm not saying in a disparaging way, you know, I'm on Discord. But
unless, of course, well, yeah, well, where we could say that is said in a disparaging way is, are some of these arguments just used in the same way that I asked this to Benatar actually in the podcast, but, you know, could this just be a kind of pseudo-intellectual way cover up the fact that someone just wants to have a kid for selfish reasons,
like a rationalization,
right? In the same way that carnists come up with these clever sounding arguments about why veganism could harm more animals or something like that,
deaths and stuff like that,
right? And it's like, dude, you don't give a fuck about crop death. Can I swear, by the way, on the stream?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right, cool. You don't give a fuck about crop deaths. You just want to eat steak, or the animals wouldn't exist without us. You don't care about the animals wouldn't exist without us. You're looking for ways to justify it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is kind of where some of these arguments are coming from, or and this is why I explored them with Benatar, whether these are real, genuine things that and do anti-natalists actually need to reconsider. So this is kind of the stuff we explore.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think it'll be a mixture, right? Some people will genuinely be coming to this topic with an open mind, and they will be swayed by these arguments that we're going to get into and hear and stuff. And other people will, as we know, like the vast majority of people have I don't know about the vast majority, but a majority of people have a, strong desire to want to create like another person, right? An experience raising someone, having a mini me, all of this sort of stuff. So it doesn't seem like it would be unlikely that someone would then want to find rationalizations for that, because it's a really strong desire that people have, whether that's partly biological and cultural, or whether it's purely biological or whatever. Just before we get into it, I wanted to say for people that obviously George and I are both coming at this from a certain perspective. Well, obviously we're both vegan, but we are both also anti-natalists, right? And I think we've both been pretty influenced by Benatar's work, right? So Absolutely. People may be watching this and thinking, well, this is anti-natalist marking their own homework. And to obviously, this stream is mostly just going to be us watching it back, breaking it down and stuff, but there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So if people want to ask a question that's going to get answered there on the spot, send in a super chat and we will see it. But at the end, when we finished watching, it'll be opened up to anyone in the stream can ask a question. Just put the word question at the start of the message so it's easy to see, and then we can bring it up on screen and talk about it. Do you have anything else you want to say before we dive in?
The only other thing I want to say before we dive in is David Benatar is he kind of has a I'll send him this stream afterwards, but he kind of has like a thing about he doesn't like to talk about an issue too long after he's discussed it, because he gets bombarded with requests to do stuff all the time.
Yeah.
So for anyone wondering, we probably won't be able to get him on the channel or ask follow-up questions to that extent. Nonetheless, I will. So David Benatar, so Professor Benatar, thank you for watching, by the way, because I'll be sending you this after. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get him on or anything, to press him on anything here, but I will send him this stream.
Yeah, and it also did sound like he was writing something just sort of vaguely around this topic. Maybe it was on the more of the predator side of things, and that I don't know when that will be coming out. He was kind of vague about it, at least on the recording. But
I'm very excited for that. I would love to read that. I don't know if it's going to be part of a thesis or something that he's working on, or whether he's fully writing a thesis about it. What I imagine it will be is he'll probably be writing something about how humans are very, very poor judges of things, just in general, and how we often make massive mistakes when we think we're going in somewhere to kind of save the world, and then we end up cocking it up. And he'll probably include the culling predators argument as maybe part of that. But I don't know.
Yeah, no, whatever it is, I'm sure it will be worth reading. So cool. Okay, I think I don't really have anything else to go over before we get into it. So let's just get straight into it. So one thing I will say is, first of all, thank you, Veghead, for the super chat. And they just say, eat fruit, don't multiply. So I think we both know what side of the aisle they're on this question. But thanks so much for that, Veghead. And also, just if people can't hear the audio that well, then just let us know in the chat. But yeah, let's kick off.
Let's go. I'm not hearing anything, Lawrence.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I know what it is.
What a way to start the stream.
Yeah, I know. I reckon it's because I didn't share
your desktop audio or something like that.
Yeah, okay, I know what it is. I've got to share it in a Chrome window, so I guess I'm going to have to get it open on all my fucking preparation I did for downloading it. It's
Have you got an ad blocker on YouTube?
Yes, but not on Google Chrome. That's really annoying.
Should we get it up on mine?
Yeah, do you want to? And then I think you have the ability to share, right?
Yeah, I've got the present setting here at the bottom. Hold on, let me.
Okay, nice.
So, what should we do? Shall maybe like you raise your hand or just interject when you want me to
I'll just start
recording?
talking. I'll just start talking and say pause, please, or whatever.
Okay, cool.
All
right. Let's get the
podcast. But cool. Okay, while you're doing that, I will say a few things. So I don't think you got into all of these with Benatar, but there are three main arguments I've heard of this type from vegans. Although not all of them would have to come from vegans, I just generally have heard them from vegans. So they all really center around if we are to follow antinatalism like really hardcore and advocate for it and it really takes off, all of this sort of stuff, then it'll have negative consequences basically. And from what I've heard, there are three like strands to this, and just tell me when you've got it ready.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've got it ready now.
Oh, okay,
so let me just put present. Now you wanted it on 1.25 speed, and what minute do you want it starting from?
What was it? Just do like 1 minute in, and we'll see where it is from there.
Okay, I'll play it on 1:55 maybe, and then we'll
Okay.
have a look. Right, let's start presenting this now. Present share screen.
Cool. So yeah, the first one I've heard is that or the first like flavor of this argument is that humans will, there we go, nice. Are you able to like narrow your screen slightly so that the video
zoom
takes
in
up?
or
you know how narrow? Oh, are you on? Yeah, something like that. So the video itself takes up. I mean, it doesn't matter that much.
I can do that.
Cool. Nice. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, cool. Right.
Cool. Let's
situation for you, my kind of thoughts and stuff first before we go into things. So I am a vegan and an
Do you want to go a bit earlier?
You can if you like. I think all you've done is just introduced him, right?
Yeah, let's just go a bit earlier just so
Cool.
we get him before that. Okay.
for the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, so I really want to say just how grateful I am that you've taken up your time to come on here, because I think what better person to talk to about this issue than you. And I think a lot of vegans actually in the movement.
Let us know, everyone, in the comments if you can hear that, by the way.
I've got the stream up here and I'm pretty sure people can.
Okay, cool. We've had CDA says I can't hear either. No Justice Lasts Forever says nothing, but that might have been
that was the other one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
They can hear. Yeah.
Folks, yeah, tell us.
Natalist vegans will be really, really interested to actually hear your view on this, because it's natalist vegans who are pushing a lot of these arguments at the moment. But I just want to explain my situation for you, my kind of thoughts and stuff first before we go into things. So I am a vegan and an antinatalist. I've been an antinatalist since coming across your work and the work of others in about 2015. And the reason I'm an anti-natalist is because of the altruistic arguments about creation of human life, and how I do believe, having been convinced by work such as yours, that it is better that we do not come into existence to creation of new suffering beings. And also for what you call in your book the misanthropic arguments. So the fact that human existence is a moral bad, the amount of harm and suffering that we cause, especially to farmed animals.
I just want to add an interesting point about that. When I first went anti-natalist in 2015, it was purely for the misanthropic reasons, as in humans are a piece of shit and I don't want more to be on the planet. Yeah. I didn't actually care when I first heard the anti-natalist arguments for the human you create is suffering argument.
Yeah.
So I was kind of this, life is beautiful kind of impression, but we are a plague to the planet. And then as I got more looking into it and read Benatar's book, I was like, yeah, life sucks, to be fair. So now I'm both versions. But yeah.
Extremely intense, the pain and suffering that humans cause. But there does exist in the animal rights movement at the moment a counter argument from natalist vegans. So vegans who think that we should procreate. And they're essentially saying that procreation in the long run is something that we ultimately need to do to help animals, and that it doesn't even make sense to be an anti-natalist if you are a vegan. So I just want to ask you, how familiar are you with the argument that not procreating could actually negatively impact animals? Like, is this an objection that has been put to you as a vegan anti-natalist during your philosophy career?
I'm aware of the objection. It hasn't been put to
George, before he gets into it, can we pause?
Yeah.
So one thing that I think that's interesting is, and this isn't a point really against the argument, it's just like a detail of it, is there's, you framed it as this sort of question of like, is antinatalism good or bad for animals, right? But the answer to that question is going to be different depending on the person you talk to. But no matter who you talk to, the answer is definitely going to be different depending on which animals you're talking about. So I don't think anyone is going to, unless they're like extremely pro-natalist and they say coming into existence is a good no matter what, I think pretty much everyone is going to say antinatalism is, if carried out to the point where humans would no longer be around, because that's essentially the fundamental question people are asking, that would clearly be a good for the animals we directly exploit, like the ones in farms, laboratories, etc.
Yeah.
So the question it's generally framed around is it good for wild animals specifically, not for animals generally, because those are two even though there is some blending there, because obviously some animals are wild but they're captured and domesticated, and obviously some domesticated animals are sort of semi-wild, so there is like a blurring of the boundary, but these generally are two different categories of animal, and the answer is going to be different for each category.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And let's get into it then. So is there a chance that refusing to create human life actually adds to the suffering that there is in the world? Reasons for this could be, for example, that humans actually clear the most land, such as rainforest destruction, building cities and so on. Is there actually a chance that this could actually add to the suffering in the world if we don't procreate?
Well, let me answer that question in part. So first of all, if we just take your question at face value, can antinatalism increase suffering? Well, obviously it can in some ways. If, for example, somebody wanted to have a child and they didn't have a child and they suffered more as a result of not having a child, then they would suffer more than they would if they had children. It doesn't follow from that there's a net increase in suffering. So we need to differentiate between increasing somebody's suffering and increasing suffering overall. Mm-hmm. But I think what lies behind your question is not that kind of narrow focus, but rather the question about whether antinatalism impacts on animal suffering in general. And I think, again, there would not be a negative effect from antinatalism. I think the net effect would be positive, but I also don't think that we should only be concerned about effects. This is where it's going to make a difference, whether you're a consequentialist or not.
Mm-hmm. So what is your normative ethic? Like, are you like a deontologist? Are you a utilitarian? How would you identify in that?
I've attempted to frame the arguments that I've advanced in a theory neutral way, because if I advance it from a particular theory, then people who reject that theory would just...
Okay, so does anyone notice, I don't know if actually anyone knows what David Benatar's normative ethics are. I don't know if he's being coy about this, maybe because he teaches philosophy and he has to maybe be less biased about this. Not that his views aren't out there anyway, and he's very known for his views on various subjects. But he says here, I try to advance this in a theory neutral way. So he's trying to advocate antinatalism in a way that appeals to everyone's normative ethics. He doesn't actually reveal his own here. Do you know what he is, or can you guess what he is? Whether he's like a utilitarian, a deontologist?
No, I've never heard him say what he is in any interview, and whenever he's been asked that directly, like you just asked that, he always just says he believes the arguments he's advanced are theory neutral, so they can be taken on any theory, right? So I mean, the only person who is going to know why he does that is him, fundamentally. One reason I suspect he does it is because he always seems to focus on the arguments he's making rather than, and how they're received by the other person, rather than his own view, or like the sort of view he's feeding into the argument, if you get what I mean. The other thing I can think of is he understands that even though he isn't even the most active academic or person on antinatalism, he is the most well-known that's alive today anyway, right? He is probably the most well-known antinatalist today and is often seen by people as the foremost proponent. And so if I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, he's probably thinking, well, given that many people make their decision about antinatalism based on what I say, I want to make it as open as possible in terms of people coming from different theoretical backgrounds. And so he doesn't want to say, I am a deontologist or I am a utilitarian, because then that may color how they receive the argument. He doesn't want to do that. That's all I can think. At the end of the day, I don't know why he does that. To be honest, I think this is maybe a reason, and a lot of people have picked up on this, and we'll obviously pick up on it as we go through, but a lot of the hypotheticals you give him, he does answer some, he does reject others and give a reason for rejecting them, but also a lot of people have said that he kind of dodges the hypotheticals or sort of avoids answering them directly, right? The reason that what I'm about to say is not trying to back him doing that, whether he answers them or not is his own business. So I'm not trying to justify either way him not answering them. But if I'm trying to put myself in his shoes and understand why he would not answer some of those hypotheticals, is that some of the hypotheticals people get into become very extreme very quickly, like, for example, the famous red button one, right? And although I think in this he does answer that one directly, right?
He does, and he doesn't.
Okay.
It's a bit of both. There's a bit of contention with it, a bit of what people are calling in the comments hypothetical dodging and stuff. But he also does give a direct answer as well. So it's a bit of both.
Right. Yeah. So the only thing I can think is he tries to avoid answering hypotheticals in the extreme, although it seems he does sometimes answer them, because he doesn't want that again to get tagged on to antinatalism, if you get what I mean. Because fundamentally, the red button question, the way I see it, is it's not even an antinatalist question. It's a question about essentially like death, right? The red button question is about ending lives rather than starting them. So to me, the red button question isn't even like an it's something brought up with antinatalists, but it could be brought up with anyone. It could be brought up with vegans. Like, would you press the red button to end all of animal exploitation? Do you get what I mean? So it can be. I think he doesn't want to get it tagged on to antinatalism specifically, is how I can maybe put myself in his shoes. But again, I don't know why fundamentally he does. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say it could be seen as an anti-procreation question rather than just because ultimately it would stop the human breeding of humans and non-human animals. The ones that we do breed. So
but I mean, but the reason that I don't think it's fundamentally an antinatalist question is because it could be applied to anything, right? It could be also applied to the vegan question of like, you don't phrase it in terms of procreation, but you phrase it in terms of it. You know, if we just press the red button, it just ends all animal exploitation. Or you could even frame it in terms of wild animal suffering. You know, would you press the red button because it's just going to end all wild animal suffering? Because you know, ultimately we don't know how humans or if they will deal with wild animal suffering. So, you know, do you get what I mean? The red button can be cashed out with basically any sort of question you're asking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Should we continue?
Let's continue.
Say, well, those arguments don't apply to us. And I, in fact, think that engaging this argument can, in a practical way, also bypass theoretical disagreements. So consequentialist arguments for natalist veganism are probably stronger or less weak, whichever way you want to put it, than non-consequentialist arguments. But I think that even those are going to fail because of how difficult it is to calculate consequences, especially the very long-term kinds of consequences that advocates of the kind of argument you're describing would be thinking of.
Can you sort of explain to a philosophy noob like myself what exactly consequentialism is and how this would be relevant?
Well, consequentialists think that we assess the moral value of an action exclusively in terms of its consequences. And so they think that the end justifies the means, always justifies the means. So long as you're going to produce the best possible outcome, whatever action you need to perform in producing that outcome is the morally right action to perform. And people who deny consequentialism are not denying that consequences matter. They just think that consequences are not necessarily decisive, that there may, for example, be some things that we ought not to do, even if it would produce the best consequences. Now, my sense is that in practice, consequentialist and non-consequentialist arguments, at least in their best versions, are going to converge on particular answers to almost all moral questions. There may be some highly rarefied examples where they're going to part ways, but in general, I think they're going to converge. And I think that they do generally converge on this question as well. So if there are many versions of the argument that you're considering, perhaps you should present to me an argument, and let's see how I would respond to it. Of course, this would be best if it were presented by somebody who believed the objection to antinatalism. I get the sense you don't believe it, but second best would be for you to present the argument, make the case, and then I'll try to respond.
Can you pause?
Sure. So I will.
Yep. So did you, this is just a question of interest really, like, did you consider getting anyone else on to the podcast who does sort of back this argument, to have more of a sort of back and forth between, or did you only ever sort of pursue just having Benatar on his own?
Yeah, I just wanted Benatar to be on his own. I didn't want it to be like a debate podcast or anything like that. I guess I wanted to play the role, the devil's advocate of the person advancing this and just press him on a few of these things. So I guess ultimately I was to be that person rather than have a person on. I would love to host a debate between him and someone else, whoever's up for it. Although as I say, he's pretty elusive. Once he's done a talk, I don't think people will be able to debate him on this for a while now that he's spoken about this. But no, I was playing that role essentially during the podcast.
Yeah.
Cool. Play the role here of a natalist vegan then. So now, by the way, as I say, I'm a philosophy noob, so I when it comes to argument, I'm not the best at splitting it into set of premises and a conclusion, but I'll just put forward like a basic kind of what in layman's term an argument. So I put it to you, Dr. Benatar, that it's hypocritical for you to be an antinatalist and a vegan because essentially humans actually clear the most land via our existence, so destruction of the rainforests and such. So that means far fewer animals in those spaces who would otherwise suffer, a horrific existence, which you write about in your books, the pain of coming into existence. So we would be sparing a huge amount of animals by coming into existence if we cause the most environmental destruction, which we can do, by buying beef and dairy and stuff. But also, the fact that we build cities, the fact that we need to be around to mitigate wild animal suffering, and humans are the only species that can do that. Is it not hypocritical that we would be an antinatalist and a vegan in that sense if we need to procreate to actually clear the most land space and to be around to mitigate suffering?
Well,
can you pause there before
a
he
version of-
answers?
Yeah.
So, what are your general thoughts on this argument? Just like your general overview thoughts when you hear it from someone.
My general overview thoughts, I guess, before I started the podcast, maybe we'll come to my thoughts after we listen to this. But I guess before the podcast, my thoughts were kind of, I'm not sure that the calculations could be correct because humans are actually the only species that creates such a high number of animals via mass breeding. And on top of that, causes the most intensity of suffering. And I put this argument forward later as well, that humans actually cause a higher intensity of suffering than any other animal on the planet. So even if it were to be the case that, so let's say, hypothetically, there would be more animals around on this planet if humans weren't here, which I wasn't even convinced of going into this anyway. Given the fact that humans create so many animals, and in every city space there's animals running around anyway. There's animals all like there's birds in the trees and stuff outside my house right now. There's squirrels and stuff running around, foxes. Humans actually cause the highest intensity of suffering to animals. There's these horrific, torture videos and stuff going around on WhatsApp of people doing these evil things to animals for money. And there's, the fact that pigs and chickens get boiled alive and stuff in slaughterhouses, which is like the most painful way to die. Humans are the only animal that can set other animals alight, which is also the most painful way to die, because there's actually objective ways to measure pain. And apparently the most painful way to die would be boiled alive or burned alive, apparently. Humans are the only animal that can actually do that. So I wasn't convinced, like, even if it was to be the case that there would be more animals suffering without humans here, fewer animals being here, but suffering to more intense levels would be worse for a suffering standpoint, in my view. Because that's, I guess, kind of part of my normative ethic. I would rather there was, I don't know, let's say you could have World A with 10 million dogs and World B with 1 dog. Let's say you have 10 million dogs suffering mildly in World A, but 1 dog suffering intensely in World B. I would probably choose World A. Because I think intensity of suffering is the main thing that I care about, and humans cause the most of that.
Yeah, I just like very quickly on the last thing you said about like in different worlds with a sort of low level intent. If you have a world where there's like 10 people, they have generally happy lives, but they sort of once a week get a dull headache for like 10 minutes. Or you have another world where it's only 1 person, but they get cluster headaches, once a week. And cluster headaches are just insanely excruciating. I also agree. Like, I think intensity is important. And even if you have in a separate scenario, more people with a lower level of pain or suffering, but in total, that suffering would outweigh that intense suffering of the one individual. To me, and I'd have to think about it some more. I don't know where I get this from, but I feel like the intense suffering, even though overall the suffering of many people over here is larger, but it's of a lower intensity spread out. To me, the intensity of suffering of that one individual seems more important to me. I'd have to think about it more to understand exactly why I think that. But I also agree with you. I think the intensity of suffering is something important. Just to give my general thoughts on this whole argument before we go into it, and I'm sort of doing this on the fly, so these aren't. I'm gonna have to. I mean, maybe one day I'll do like a proper video on this and fully flesh out everything. But my sort of overview thoughts are like, this argument won't apply everywhere, because humans replacing even if we assume, which I think is a valid assumption, that there are some areas of nature or wildlife that clearly have more suffering going on than in a human town or city, that's not going to be the case everywhere, right? So if you go to the Arctic where everything's frozen, or you go to a desert and build a city, you've clearly introduced many, many more sentient beings than there were before, right?
And you know what, Lawrence? I'm not even convinced anyway that there's less suffering in a city space than there is in nature, because we have fucking slaughterhouses. So even in even in like an area like the UK where we both live, which doesn't have these extremes of climates and like barren landscapes without animals running around, I'm convinced that even in Bristol, where I am now, there is more suffering here than there actually would be if humans didn't build Bristol. Because not only
it would just be woodland and stuff,
right? But and there would be animals in this woodland suffering. Now we have animals suffering here, and we have the wild. So the wild animals are still suffering here in Bristol. We have humans suffering here to boot, and on top of that, we have the slaughterhouses and farms in Bristol where these animals are suffering horrific deaths, and then all these animals around the world as well, who people in Bristol are paying to be tortured as well. On top of that, so. I just reject the idea anyway that there's more suffering in an area of wildland than a city space. I think there's more in a city space, actually.
Yeah. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, to take the argument of face value, that there are at least some places where this would apply, right? Where if you built a city on top of, let's say, the Amazon, then overall there would be less suffering going on. Now, I can see the validity in that consideration. Like, look, I can understand where someone's coming from when they say, you know, if antinatalism really catches on and birth rates just plummet, which, let's be honest, they're plummeting anyway, and it's got nothing to do with antinatalism. So, you know, around the Western world and in many developed countries, or even countries that wouldn't be considered like properly developed, many of them have birth rates that are either just at replacement or below replacement level, and it has nothing to do with antinatalism. So to me, it does.
Completely lost your sound, Lawrence. The last thing I heard from you was, so to me, it doesn't.
Thank you so much. My number is 55. Thank you.
Okay, speak now. I'm hearing some little echoes of sound.
Testing.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, that was so weird. I don't know why that happened. If I wasn't on mute or anything, I hadn't accidentally touched the mute. If that happens again, just keep watching the video and I'll just come back when I come back.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there. Clearly the vegan natalists have got some, you know, tech skills in their
the Discord nerds have hacked.
Where did you last hear me?
You said, to me, it doesn't. So you were building the argument that you was like, let's say for the sake of argument, you do build a city over an area of wildland such as the Amazon. And let's say for the sake of argument, it was actually true that in this city space,
right,
you had created, as a result of this city being built there, less suffering was in that area.
Right. Yes. So I can conceive of a future where, if antinatalism were to catch on, and birth rates were to massively decline as a result, which I don't know if you guys heard this part, but birth rates were already significantly declining across the world. So this is an issue that we are going to have to face anyway. I don't understand why this critique is just leveled at antinatalists and why it isn't leveled at, you know, public policy experts or people that are, you know, work in this area and have real influence over what policies are put in place, for example. Because if I was one of these vegan natalists, I would not be trying to debate anti-natalists online who have no influence in health. If I purported to care about as much about this as they do, I would be trying to influence public policy. Do you get what I mean? So I don't think it's just something that should be brought up with anti-natalists, and also it's not anti-natalism that is going to cause this issue. But let's just say hypothetically it was. Anti-natalism catches on, birth rates go down even further than they are as a result. And that does lead, and there could be a future where that does lead to more suffering than in the alternative world, where antinatalism didn't have that impact, right? Like, I'm open, like that is something that could happen. I don't know if it would. First of all, I don't think antinatalism is going to have that impact. But even if it did, I don't know if that is going to be the future that comes about. The future, as Benatar says throughout the interview, the future is so uncertain, especially now with wars popping up across the globe. Like, it doesn't, the future seems so uncertain just for humans, let alone for animals, that it doesn't seem like we can make clear statements about the impact that your action is going to have in the long term. And I recognize that it is a possible future, and I'll be honest, I just often don't know what to do with that. It's like with anything, if we were to eradicate animal farming as we want to, some people could say, well, animal farming takes up a massive amount of land. Why don't we continue with grass-fed beef? That takes up a massive amount of land. It's only a few animals that get killed for it. Why don't we do that to, avoid there being an increase in wild animal suffering? Like, at the end of the day, I don't know what to do with that. Like, any of my actions that influence the world could play into a future that has more suffering overall. To me, all I can really do is, as an individual, assess what I think the actions in and of themselves are immoral or not. So killing an animal or creating someone as an action, if you want, in a vacuum, I view as immoral.
Yeah.
And to me, as Benatar says, some claim about a vague future notion that there may be an increase in suffering, which I have no real way to understand if that is going to happen or not, because the future is so uncertain, especially now. I often don't know what to do with that, and maybe I'm being ignorant, maybe I'm being an idiot, but often, even if this argument is right from the vegan natalists, I don't know what to do with that. And it to me, it's not enough to convince me that I should be procreating, or that procreation is ethical.
Because either way, you're still violating someone's rights for your own political goals. Ultimately, like, you're using children as pawns in a game. It's like, I wouldn't accept that from my parents either. Let's just say again, for the sake of argument, that it's true that, like, me having a kid, my parents creating me, whatever, causes less suffering in the world or something overall. If that was their goal, I would still be like, I don't accept you using me as like a means to do that. You should have looked for alternate ways to do that. Like, I don't think, and I think Benatar kind of alludes to this later. Like, let's say that you committed a genocide or something with the goal of creating less suffering in the future, and this genocide, hypothetically, it's like, wiping this group of people out will mean their offspring's gone, and all the animals that they would otherwise breed wouldn't be bred now. It's like, you can't really make these massive rights violations just because of some calculations you've made about a future world with less suffering. Someone coming into the room now just shooting me and you in the head might mean that there's less suffering, all right, because number one, me and you can't suffer anymore,
Yeah.
and blah blah blah. But that doesn't mean that the rights violation is justified necessarily.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we can continue in a minute because I know there's a lot to get through, but I think Benatar also says it, and you kind of hinted at it there, right? Like, if our parents came to us with that justification, you know, like, find an alternative. Do you get what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it to me, I'm extremely sympathetic with people who care about, or extremely sympathetic with wild animals as well. I think it is a big issue. I know not every vegan does think it's a big issue, and they think we should solely focus on the animals that we directly exploit. I think we should do both. I think we should help wild animals and stop abusing domesticated animals. So I have a lot of sympathy with the concerns that people who care about wild animals have. But when I think about my concern for wild animals, it doesn't automatically lead me to say I should create more people. There are so many. If people are saying that we should replace the land that wild animals are on, so there's less of them, there are so many other things I could do than create someone else. What if I create someone and they're like an environmentalist hippie and they have a really low footprint? I could have better spent my time and money that I would have put into raising them into intentionally causing habitat loss and environmental degradation. Do you get what I mean? And it's like, I can control where those resources and that effort goes to. Whereas if I create someone and they end up being an environmental campaigner, they could start advocating for rewilding and be acting against. Do you get what I mean? So it seems like, why would you outsource the actions you want to do to a child who, one, you don't have complete control over, and they may actually do the opposite of what it's the same with people who, they say we need to continue the animal rights movement, so we should breed more vegans, basically. But anyway, unless you have any thoughts, we can keep going.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. So yeah, let's continue.
Your argument can be advanced either by a natalist vegan or a natalist non-vegan. Now, one version of the argument would just say, even to the natalist vegans, well, if you're really interested in maximizing human damage to the environment and thereby contributing to the extinction of wild animal species, why don't you in fact eat meat? Because that will increase the demand for the destruction of rainforests. Mm-hmm. So you can see where this begins to lead for the natalist vegan. But more generally, I would say about this argument is that there are multiple ways that you could bring about the extinction of wild animals if you wanted to. And it's not obvious that having babies is the best way to do that. You could just increase your production. So you could be an anti-natalist and also, let's say, consume meat, or just gratuitously contribute towards the destruction of wild animal habitat so that you can bring about the reduction of wild animal species. But of course, there are further consequentialist worries here because, yes, you might reduce certain species, but that might just open up the way for other animal species to proliferate because some animals have declined in numbers. And so it might well be that other kinds of animal suffering just increases. So I think the general point here is that there are so many imponderables when it comes to the consequences of one's actions that to start suggesting that we should do things that are on the face of it are deeply immoral because somehow we've got an account of how that might produce the best consequences, when in fact we're not beginning to fathom all of the causal factors and features that might operate here, is, I think, not only naive, but dangerously naive.
So why don't you, as an anti-natalist, for example, is there anything stopping you from increasing your demand for a certain product that would clear the most land to prevent the most wild animals coming into existence, for example? Is this something you would do, or would you not do this?
Well, I wouldn't do it, I think, for more than one reason. But the worry is, why would you engage in an activity that on the face of it is deeply harmful on the grounds that this is going to lead to less bad overall, when you actually have very little grounds for thinking that it will lead to less harm overall, given the complexity of all the causal operations that are at work in the world?
So let's take deforestation, for example. The amount of rainforest that humans clear every second is astonishing. I think just the beef and dairy industry alone clears a football pitch size of rainforest every single second or something like that. Like, it's just astronomical. What would be bad about that, in your opinion, given all the... Is it not the case that this is a good thing because it's actually like an antinatalist or an ethicist dream, right? I mean, there's going to be no animals coming into existence in those areas.
It's going to cause a vast amount of suffering. So if you think about destruction of rainforests, that not only removes habitat for some animals, and so even if you think that there'll be fewer of those animals and they won't suffer, but then think about whatever animals fill the niche that is left by that. But quite independently of that, it contributes towards global warming. And global warming doesn't just increase the number of beings that dies, it also increases the amount of suffering that there is in the world, both for humans and for non-human animals. And again, global warming is unlikely to eliminate all sentience from the world unless it reaches truly astronomical proportions. But what it might well do is kill off certain kinds of beings, and then others might fill the niche. So again,
this is another thing, that I had a slight bit of cognitive dissonance about with regards to the fact that I'm an antinatalist and a vegan, and yet me being vegan is actually quote unquote helping the environment and like preventing global warming. And it's like, well, why don't I want global warming, right? But then he's saying, actually, let's say humans do just completely cock up the planet because of animal agriculture or whatever it may be. That still probably wouldn't actually wipe all sentient life off the planet, and there would just be a reburgeoning anyway. Because let's say like the planet just turns into a complete wasteland because of humans. Humans go extinct, and thousands and thousands and thousands of animals go extinct and stuff due to global warming. There would still be sentient life left somewhere, and there would just be animals that then just go on to fill that void, I guess. Or maybe more plants would grow and eventually breathe more oxygen into the planet. So it would keep kind of recycling and stuff anyway, I think.
Yeah, I had a similar cognitive dissonance. So I actually used to, they're now called Animal Rising, but when they were called Animal Rebellion, I used to go around and give talks for Animal Rebellion. And part of that talk was promoting rewilding, because obviously the talk was all based around changing to a plant-based food system is better for animals and the environment. And, if we switch to a plant-based food system, it will massively decrease land use, so that can then be rewilded. And I then and around that time is when Jack Hancock, started talking about wild animal suffering, and he made a video debunking the very case study that I used to use to promote rewilding, which was a Yellowstone National Park one. And after watching that video and thinking about it a bit more, I actually stopped promoting rewilding in those talks. And then, it's hard to look back on now, and it's easy to impose a narrative on something you did in the past, looking back on it. I'm not sure. I eventually stopped doing the talks. I can't remember if it was because of that reason or not. But I went through a period of cognitive dissonance as well, where I used to, as a vegan, really promote environmentalism and rewilding and all this sort of stuff. Ending the lives of wild animals from their perspective, rather than the perspective of humans looking at nature and stuff like this. I went through a similar process.
Cool.
General point is, why would you, even if you're a consequentialist, engage in actions that are immediately and obviously harmful on the justification that you're going to be producing less harm in the long run, when in fact, given how distant those consequences are, and given the complex causal relations between what you do and the purported outcome, you actually can't be sure at all that it's going to produce less suffering in the long run.
What do you think of species extinction? Is it a good thing, or is it a bad thing for you?
Depends on how it's brought about. So I think that if species can die off in bad ways, so if there's lots of suffering on the way, the process of the species becoming extinct can be very bad because of all the suffering that's involved. But if you're asking me about the end state, that there are no more beings of that kind, well, I don't think that's bad for the species. It might be bad for other beings. So if we don't have particular animals to behold and be marveled by and or to marvel at, then that's a loss for us. There may be other animals that benefit. Sometimes there's symbiotic relations between animals, and if so, one species dies off and then another species is unable to engage in those symbiotic relations, then that existing species will be worse off. So there can be those aspects of species extinction which are worrying. But the mere state of a species being extinct, whether it be human or some other animal, that I don't think is bad. And so what's crucial to this whole argument is whether you can separate out the mere state of extinction from how it's brought about.
So I just want to pick up on one point you mentioned a moment ago, which is that
Can we pause?
Yeah,
it may be a harm for other species.
So this is like related to one thing I was saying earlier about how I think sometimes Benatar is really wary of the fact that many people look up to him, and there are many people who like respect him and enjoy listening to him, that are in this realm of people that want to end suffering, basically, right?
Yeah.
And it's like many things, a good idea taken too far to its most extreme can lead people to do the dumbest, most immoral shit you can think of, right? And I think he often either likes to avoid answering questions or answering them very carefully, because he knows if he says a certain thing that can be misinterpreted by some random person online who is deranged by something that is at base a good idea but taken to its extreme can be very harmful. I think he's probably wary of setting people off like that. So when he speaks about, I mean, also he just wants to be, philosophically clear. But when he answers questions like that about extinction, I think at least part of why he's so discerning between extinction and going extinct is partly because he doesn't want to set random, people off to say, oh, well, I will actively try and go around and bring about the extinction of X species or whatever, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Cool. Is if a certain species go extinct. I guess this is part of the natalist vegan logic who put forward this argument. They're basically saying that human extinction would be harmful to other animals, and it's actually better that we're around. Do you think on the whole it is better for animals that humans exist?
No.
Can you elaborate on that?
Cause a vast amount of suffering, most obviously in the domesticated animals who are reared for food.
Yeah.
Lawrence, can I just butt in on a little argument that's going on right now in the comments section? And I just want to put someone right who's
yeah, go on. I haven't really been following.
There's a natalist in the comments section calling himself transhuman wrought, so right spelled incorrectly. And what they are saying is that procreation is the way to actually spread an idea. And they're using the false analogy of saying how Muslims proved this. Now, the reason Muslims seemingly spread through procreation and stuff, that's fully from fear, telling that child when they're a little kid, you will go to hell if you do not believe in this. That's how Islam spreads via procreation. You can't spread other ideas like that through procreation. Your kid will be completely different from you unless you create whatever ideology it is, transhuman right, as an actual religion, and tell your child you will burn in hell if you leave this ever at any point in your life. Unfortunately for you, mate, there is absolutely no way of spreading whatever your ideology is through procreation. So no, Muslims don't prove this at all. The reason Islam spreads via procreation is through the idea of the little kid being terrified that they'll burn in hell. If you're a communist, your kid ain't going to be a communist. If you are, I don't know, pro-trans rights, your kids could be anti-trans rights. If you are left-wing, your kid could be right-wing. If you are religious but you don't believe in hell and don't teach your kid about hell, like a liberal Muslim might not, their kid is not likely to actually stay Muslim. So what you're talking about here is just spreading ideology through instilling fear in a child from birth. I just thought I would.
Yeah. Well, and also just like if on the topic of religion as well, like many religions also spread themselves by war and conquest as well, right? And forced conversions on the pain of death. So and multiple religions have done that. So you can't also just put it down to it is what you're saying as well, indoctrination, on pain of hell, but it's also conquest and war historically. So I mean,
if we did want to spread veganism like through procreation, it would have to be done by either teaching those kids they will burn in hell if they leave veganism and creating like a religion about that, or spreading it via the sword and procreation or something, however the hell that would work. Cool.
We cause vast amounts of suffering and increasing amounts of suffering as the human population is growing, but we also cause vast amounts of suffering among wild animals, because they suffer as a result of human encroachment on their habitats, as a result of the global warming that we are causing, as a result sometimes of hunting. There are all kinds of ways in which we inflict harm on other species, including wild animals.
Now, if it was the case that humans didn't exist, would there not be more animals in the world suffering? What do you make of that argument? More birth in the world overall because of all the space that would be available for wild animals to procreate?
There might be. I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to know all the possible outcomes. And I think one of my objections is this playing God. And I don't mean playing God in the ordinary sense. It's that you think you've got a better overall assessment of what you can do, and you've got a greater you got an inflated view about your own agency and your own power, and so you think that what you can do now is make these fine-grained calculations so that you engage in horrific actions in order to produce less harm down the line.
Can we pause?
Let's imagine somebody wants to engage in a genocide.
So I'll just say this super quickly because we've still got a lot to get through, but I really sympathize with what he's saying there, because I've even had that personally. So I've so many times sat down and thought, what actions shall I take, or how shall I direct my life so that it has it has the best it leads to the best future. How can I be someone to sort of help mold the best future possible, or that we can achieve. And this isn't an argument or anything I'm making. It's just sharing my personal experience. So many times I've thought in that way, and eventually just come back to, look, I have no idea what the future is going to be like. And to think that I can zoom out and sort of feel like I have any agency over moving these pawns around in potential futures is just ludicrous. So I really just need to focus on what can I do as an individual to try and avoid making other, life shit for others, and lessening my impact in that way, and trying to make the world a better place in ways that are good in the immediate and seem generally like they will have a good future impact, but trying to measure to every degree. And I think this isn't just like this argument that does this, but also like generally, ideas like effective altruism also do this as well, is trying to measure all of the outcomes of your actions into the far future. I don't know, on a personal level, it can often just cripple you. Do you get what I mean? I don't know if you've ever had that as well.
What, just the the burden of just like trying to calculate every tiny little thing, like
exactly. And I often see people online doing this, like, trying to calculate every little way that their impacts are going to have their actions are going to have an impact on the far future in 1,000 years or whatever. And I just often look at it and be like, mate, just focus on the here and now, and, just make reasonable actions that aren't going to, massively harm anyone, and that aren't going to play into any really obvious shit future scenarios, like, pursuing nuclear war or some shit like that.
Yeah. All right.
Of let's say, a persecuted minority. And they say, well, this is actually a good action because we're going to kill off all these people. And that means that all their descendants will not be subject to discrimination that they would otherwise be exposed to.
Right.
And that is just a truly bizarre argument to think that engaging in mass murder is going to be justified because you've got this view that in the long run, there'll be fewer people who will be suffering as a result. You really are attributing to yourself much too much responsibility, much too much authority to make these kinds of decisions, much too much confidence in your ability to make them correctly. This is just optimism running rampant.
Let's say the person was objectively right. Let's say they do have all the answers. And because this was one of the questions I was going to ask you actually was about overfishing. Now, humans massacre, I think it's something like 2 trillion marine animals every single year. Now, your point there was obviously, playing God in the sense of, thinking that we have all the answers and that kind of thing. And we're essentially committing a genocide of various marine animals. But of course, the, quote unquote, net positive of that is, well, this clears future generations of those animals from suffering. Let's say just someone was objectively right about that. They did have all the answers. They've made the calculations. They've absolutely weighed up that we should commit to overfishing because this will just massively reduce future suffering. You're talking about trillions more marine animals not being born into this hellish existence that all animals face on this planet. What would be wrong with their argument, hypothetically, if they just knew all the facts, they'd made all the calculations, and they were just right about this?
Well, I can answer that question, but I don't want to rush into answering it because it's a massive hypothetical. And just think in practice. You see, my worry is that you answer this question hypothetically, and then somebody comes along and says, in their great self-confidence, I've done those calculations and I've worked it out and I know. And that's the very worry that I have, is that people will attribute to themselves more wisdom, more understanding, more knowledge, more authority than they're entitled to attribute to themselves. So let's imagine we massively deplete the oceans of wild animals. But we don't complete the job. Well, there's every bit of evidence to think that there will then be a revirgining of ocean life. You'd have to pretty much hunt it to extinction in order to avoid. And if you eliminate some species entirely, you may just be opening up niches for other animals to boost in numbers. And these are things that human beings just cannot possibly calculate with any kind of confidence. If you've got the confidence, it's overconfidence.
Do you think?
So that's okay.
I was going to say that, do you think that a lot of these arguments put forward by natalist vegans about, because you mentioned the overconfidence and stuff, about, more humans equals less animal suffering overall. Do you think these are kind of just sophist or pseudo-intellectual kind of arguments that just aim to cause a distraction from the fact that that natalist just wants to procreate? In the same way that non-vegans, they give these fake altruistic arguments for not ending the massacre of animals. They'll say stuff like, oh, but these animals, they wouldn't get a chance to live, and you're putting people out of jobs and blah blah blah. When the underlying reason is they just want to eat a tasty, juicy steak, right? Do you think that this is kind of the thing that some of these more advanced natalist vegan debaters, do you think this is what they're doing? Do you think that they're just using like a sense of fake altruism about this because deep down they just want to have a kid, and that's just the reason they're arguing this?
Well, I can't speak to the motivations of every last person who advances an argument of this kind. I would be surprised if there are no people who have those motivations, but I can't say to every last person. What I can do is evaluate the argument itself. Mm-hmm. And you're right, I do think that arguments of that kind amount to sophistry for the reasons that I've mentioned. If, for example, you are a vegan and you now think that you ought to have more children because that's a good way to drive down the wild animal population, well, you could do it both ways. You could not have a child, and thereby preventing the suffering of the child you would create, while at the same time beginning to eat meat and engage in other environmentally destructive things in order to reduce the wild animal population. So it's not obvious that if you really want to introduce these long and complex.
So one thing I just very quickly want to say is that what his answer there about you could go either way, right? You could not have a child and spend all the money that you have on really destructive things like eating loads of beef or whatever, right? This isn't like just something that he's saying and hasn't happened. Like, this has happened. People have pursued this argument, and instead of choosing to procreate, they've gone the other route and ditched veganism. So one person who I think is relatively well known for doing this is Brian Tomasic. He is very sort of deep into utilitarianism and trying to find exactly which actions are going to lead to, reducing the most suffering in wild animals. And yeah, he I don't know if actually he was ever vegan. I think at one point he was, and he stopped being vegan, but he is intentionally not vegan for this argument, because he sees animal products as a means of reducing wild animal suffering, right? But there are other people that have also renounced veganism because of this argument. So it's not like people are just saying, oh, well, you know, this also means that you could go this way, but then it's like, well, no one does that. But people do that. Like, this argument does stop people from being vegan, if you get what I mean. So yeah, I just wanted to make people aware of that like this does actually have implications for people, yeah, not being vegan anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of worrying. It's just kind of more cognitive dissonance, isn't it? That someone out there has made this calculation that them being non-vegan will actually decrease the amount of suffering in the world. It's like, oh god.
Yeah, well, it's you know, it's also like, you know, there are some vegans who put loads of heavy emphasis on systems change, pressure campaigning, this sort of stuff, and not convincing people to be vegan, which, don't get me wrong, I think that sort of activism is important, but sometimes people lean in so much to that narrative that they actually convince people to give up veganism or just not go vegan, because they put so much faith in changing the system, if you get what I mean, rather than changing what they're doing as an individual. There is someone specifically I'm thinking about who sort of pushes this line, and people as a result have stopped being vegan or aren't vegan. But I don't want to cause drama, and you probably know the person, so we can
all right, yeah, I've got a person in mind, but right, let's go.
Causal processes to bring about fewer wild animals, that the way to do that is by having children. Yes, the number of people on the planet is a variable, but it's not the only variable. And it's also very unlikely that you're having a child. In other words, one solitary additional person is going to have the kind of impact that argument assumes you're going to have.
Yeah.
So it's a clever sounding argument, but I don't think it's a wise argument. There's a distinction I've drawn before between being clever and being wise.
Do you think that there would be more animals in a city space if we didn't build? Let's take London or New York, for example. Do you agree that there would be more wild animals in that city space if London or New York wasn't built? Or do you think it would just be about the same? For example, because, you know, in any city there's tons of, you know, rats and foxes and squirrels and stuff. They're all going around. Or do you agree with the kind of natalist vegan argument that actually in a city space there would be more wild animals suffering in that city space area?
There'd probably be more wild animals, but there'd also probably be fewer of what we call liminal animals, which are animals that inhabit the space between the domestic and the wild. And some of the animals that you've referred to, like rats, would be liminal animals. Now, of course, you could have a wild rat. There are wild rats, but the high rat population in places like New York is at least partly attributable to the large human population and the ample supply of food that humans provide, and also the absence of other kinds of predators. So to the extent that there are fewer, let's say, wild bird predators in New York, there'll be fewer animals of that kind predating on the liminal rats. And this, again, is why I think these are impossible calculations to do. To think you're going to know what the net number of sentient animals is, whether it's wild or liminal, these are sort of impossible calculations. And I don't think that we ought to be engaging, as I said before, in harmful activities on the supposition that this will cause less suffering in the long run, when we don't have good reason for thinking that's the case.
Interesting. And I think the key bit they're missing here, that just seems like a huge missight, is that humans are the only species that actually mass breeds other species. So people talk about, is there more suffering in a city space than an area of wild land, whatever. Well, they're forgetting these concentration camp factory farms and slaughterhouses and stuff where humans are breeding billions of animals every single year worldwide into. So could there be the argument that actually in a city space, in an area of human civilization, not only are those species that you mentioned, like rats and stuff, more populous, but also there you have to account for the billions of farmed animals. So could it be the case that human existence actually creates more animal life than there otherwise would be if we didn't exist?
Again, that's a calculation that is almost impossible to do. And so what we need to be asking ourselves is, is it right to be creating animals, killing them prematurely, and eating them? And I think that the answer to that question is no. And it doesn't really matter which ethical theory you want to employ, because the most plausible versions of all the theories are going to suggest that that's wrong to do. If somebody comes along and wants to offer a kind of consequentialist argument, whereby they say, well, in the very long run, it's actually going to produce better results or less bad results, that, as I said before, I think is just overconfidence. Think back to the human example. So let's imagine somebody says, well, I could actually save all future human suffering by eliminating all humans in the world, and so I should engage in the species side of killing all humans. That's a deeply worrying argument to be making, because you're engaging in mass murder because you believe, without very good evidence, that in the long run that will produce less suffering. Remember, the human population can spring back from the very small numbers. For most of human history, there were relatively few human beings around. And yet we burgeoned from there into our current population.
Yeah, so when you were on Amanda's podcast, the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, she asks the question to every guest towards the end, would you press the red button, which wipes out humanity? Would you not press the red button?
I would not press the red button. People have tried to push me on, excuse that expression, on this question before, and I've sometimes tried not to answer it, but I would not. I would not press the red button. I think on some theories, there's going to be a good theoretical reason not to press it, because you engaged in mass murder, and mass murder could be viewed as wrong irrespective of the consequences. But even on a consequentialist view, the idea that you could be supremely confident with justification that you're pressing this button would eliminate all sentient life and thereby avoid more suffering in the long run, I don't think any human is justified in making a claim of that kind. Not in any practical situation.
Yes, because the way I've always viewed the red button, so I've always been someone who said, yes, I would press the red button. But I guess and people would respond, such as yourself, you'd say, well, this would be engaging in mass murder. My way of looking at it has always been, it's actually a way of preventing mass murder. So humans are obviously the species that mass murders by the trillion animals every single year. So it would be, in my view, it's always been the same as, do you kill all the Nazis to save all the Jews kind of thing? That would be like the analogy. So I've never seen a moral problem, certainly from that perspective, of pressing the red button, because you'd ultimately be ending the horrific stuff that's happening to animals at the hands of humans worldwide. What would you see are the flaws in my view that I've always held about that?
Well, again, I think, first of all, there's a distinction to be drawn between a kind of deontological view and a consequentialist view. Mm-hmm. And if it's the case that people have a right not to be murdered, then you've got a duty not to murder them, even if you could produce better consequences. So that's from the deontological view or a rights-based view. If you go for the consequentialist view, then it becomes a kind of practical question as to whether you really have good enough reason for overriding a rule that would be justified on consequentialist grounds in order to produce what you take to be a greater good, when in fact you don't have good reason for thinking that they would be that greater good.
But do we not have good reason to say that it would produce? I mean, it would completely eliminate farming, fishing, torture, and animal abuse.
Think about the practicality of it. I mean, how would you kill all the humans?
Oh, it's just a red button. Like, it's the hypothetical red button. So I press the
red button. Can we pause?
And every human on the planet vanishes.
So what after? So we obviously know what you thought about the red button before, because you just explained. Do you think about it any differently after having spoken to him about it?
No, if it's already preloaded into the hypothetical that just pressing the red button would wipe out the human race, yeah, I can't see any reason not to press it. I just think, like, I just think it'd be the number one. All right, let me tell you my two reasons for pressing it.
And
number one, is
it all humans or all life?
I'd press it in both cases.
Right.
Wherever it is, all life would be preferable, but all humans, I would still press the red button. Because number one, I want to end the animal holocaust, which pressing the red button would just be the quickest way to do, and all the and every single oppression that could come from that. Number two, now people could respond here by saying, "Oh, but the wild animal suffering will continue and blah 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 if humans are here." But actually, I think the best way to completely eliminate all life on Earth is to allow all humans not to be here and then we can pray for astrological disaster. Because if humans are here, we would be the only species that would stop astrological disaster. Furthermore, we would migrate life to other planets if it ever came to it. So I don't want humans to be here to save the Earth from astrological disaster or to move life to other planets and just start holocausting beings on those other planets.
So I'm thinking of actually making a video about this, but I think I'm happy to like discuss with people about the red button and stuff. And just to answer it directly, honestly, I don't know if I would press it or not, but I lean towards pressing it. But I think the more important thing is that I don't think that the red button discussion is really that useful in the grand scheme of things, because especially for antinatalism, because one, as I explained earlier in the stream, I don't think it specifically enlightens anything about antinatalism. It just really enlightens someone as to how far you're willing to go for your ethical views, rather than for any ethical view, rather than antinatalism. But also, it's one of those discussions where it has no practical implementation. It is purely hypothetical, whereas many hypotheticals, you know, for example, we'll get onto predators later. People are speaking about it in hypotheticals now, but it actually has practical implementation, right? It possibly in the future. Whereas with a red button, like, we're never going to be in a situation where we have this magic red, but do you get what I mean? And so, yeah, and given how extreme the thought experiment is, it seems extremely likely to be something that, if antinatalists do get into the limelight, that can just get picked up on, and it becomes like a nutcracker thing where every time someone speaks to an antinatalist, they go right to the most extreme thing of the red button, and they get fixated on that, rather than talking about, well, there are actual very real ethical considerations you need to make as an individual about whether you're going to create someone or not. But people get distracted by this. You know, it's like when you confront like a left-wing non-vegan and you're trying to talk to them about them paying for pigs to be stabbed in the throat, and they're trying to tell you about fucking Das Kapital and the horrors of capitalism and shit. And it's like, yes, that is like some like side large scale thing we can discuss if you want, but right now we need to talk about your individual actions, if you get what I mean. So I think it's like, it can be interesting to talk about, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think the red button is like really that useful in antinatalist discourse. But yeah, I don't know. Those are just my general thoughts on it. I don't know if, I'm open to hearing like pushback and stuff on that, but yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, cool.
All right.
But what are the conditions under which you know all of these things? So you're not imagining yourself as a human being pressing the button, because no human being could be competent of those things. You're imagining yourself as a god. So this is a hypothetical scenario for God. It's not a hypothetical scenario for any human being. This is exactly the worry that I have. The worry that I have is that people are too optimistic about their own abilities and their own knowledge and their own understanding. And we've had multiple instances of this over human history, where, for example, there's some kind of a pest, and so humans introduce a predator in order to control the pest, and then the predator that they introduce becomes a pest of its own. I mean, these are sort of relatively small-scale interventions that people make, and just cause havoc. And humans just don't seem to learn from their own history. They don't seem to learn how bad they are at making these kinds of decisions. And so even on consequentialist grounds, there's very good reason for just saying, look, we're not going to press red buttons, because to entrust that decision to any human being is deeply unfounded. No human being is going to have the knowledge and the wisdom to be able to make that decision and to press that button.
So what you're essentially saying is, let's say, I mean, for example, obviously, one thing that obviously we don't need to be God, so to speak, to know is that humans are the only species that farms animals, right? So obviously I would know that it would eliminate animal farming in that regard instantly. But are you saying that there is a chance that by me pressing this red button and just wiping out the human race, just like the click of a finger like that, maybe something worse could happen, and I'm being overconfident in my abilities to judge that it wouldn't? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you might think that pressing that button will eliminate all humans, and it doesn't.
Oh, let's just say, for the sake of the hypothetical, that it does. But let's just say that that is what happens.
But that's the question that the human faces, as to whether they know they're in that situation or not. If you're a human being and you're faced with this decision, one thing you've got to factor in is I'm a human being. So how do I know that pressing this red button is going to have that consequence? Did somebody tell me that? Did I wire this up myself in some way? How do I know that?
Oh, no, it's obviously not a real scenario that has any kind of... it's just for the sake of the hypothetical, we do know for a fact. Like, it's just that's in the hypothetical already. So it's not something that we can
you also
change.
know for a fact. You also know for a fact that you're a human, and when you know for a fact that you're a human, you know that you're fallible. You know that you could be getting it wrong. And one of the things you could be getting wrong is whether pushing the button is going to have precisely the effect that you think it's going to have.
It's interesting just how much of Benatar's ethics stem from the fact that humans are so fallible. And I guess this is why he wrote Better Never to Have Been, and why he's an anti-natalist. And I come to this soon. He even sees humans as poor judges of their own lives. That's just how fallible he sees humans. If we're so fallible that we're not even a good judge, a reliable judge of whether our own lives are good and whether therefore it's okay for us to come into existence. He's obviously therefore going to have views that humans are just like not to be trusted with red buttons and stuff about, where all these other questions come up.
Yeah, and I don't think he's necessarily, at least in this bit anyway, I don't think it's really necessarily fair to characterize him as not saying you're doing this, but some people watching may think he's dodging hypotheticals, because he did straight out the bat give an answer to the hypothetical. I think now what he's doing is he's putting more emphasis on the fact that this hypothetical doesn't really have any practical implementation. And obviously he's a philosophical pessimist, so he really wants to drill down or drill into people's heads the fact that, things generally are much worse than we think in terms of quality of human life, as he explains in his book, but also human capacity. And he's trying to highlight that in this, in pushing back against the hypothetical, I guess. Because I think it's extremely easy, especially when you're, talking about philosophy, to just drift further and further away from reality into la la land with the hypotheticals. And that's not always the case. Many hypotheticals do have practical, like they relate to the practical world, and, they're important for figuring out what people actually believe and value. But I've seen so many times, and I've done it myself, you just drift into the weirdest fucking... In fact, I can well, anyway, we won't get into that anecdote, but anyway, let's continue.
Okay, let me adjust the hypothetical and let me say that you are now Lord Benatar, the superhuman, and you just do possess this, insane knowledge that pressing this red button would be a net good because, it's going to end the mass murder, the massacre of these trillions of animals every single year. You're not human. You are now superhuman in this hypothetical, who has godlike powers. Would there now be a problem with pressing this red button and wiping out the human race?
When you say superhuman and godlike, are you willing to go all the way and say have all the attributes of God? Or is this occupying some intermediate space? So you're not infallible, you're not omniscient, you're not omnibenevolent. What are the conditions here? Because if you fall short of divine infallibility, then the problem would persist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look,
I suppose you could argue that if you just felt very, very, very little short of the divine qualities, then maybe. But you then at least are very much approaching the God scenario of pushing the button. And so I'm not sure how much that helps. I mean, you're either a human now, or you're, if not God, then very, very close to God. But the God dilemma is not a dilemma that any one of us faces.
Now, is there? You said you would see no obviously problem with human extinction. Did I pick that up earlier that you said earlier in the podcast, or did I get that wrong?
With the state of human extinction, I don't think there'd be anything problematic. No, anything bad. I think there could be something wrong with how humans become extinct.
Right. So for you as a vegan who's lowering your environmental impact with that regard, do you think, like, because this is something that I've kind of struggled with cognitive dissonance with over the years, because as an anti-natalist, you know, I've watched have you seen Cowspiracy, the documentary?
I'm not sure whether I have. I've certainly heard of it, but I'm not sure I've seen it.
Because, you know, I watched this when it came out years ago. I think it came out in about 2016 or something like that. And I watched it and I was like, wow, you know, this is very inspiring. And I'm so glad I'm vegan, and look at all this brilliant stuff like that, how I'm helping the environment and stuff like that. But the cognitive dissonance has arisen since then, because it's like, well, hold on, I'm an anti-natalist. Why do I care about extinction? Why do I care about, oh, we're saving humanity, and we're saving the animals in the rainforest, and you know, the fish in the ocean, and all this kind of stuff. Do you think that I'm right to feel some kind of cognitive dissonance over this, or do you think that my morals are in alignment as a vegan who is lowering my environmental destruction massively just by being vegan, and as an anti-natalist and an ethicist who just doesn't want life to exist on this planet?
I think there is often a sentimentality that intrudes, not only with regard to the extinction of our own species, but with regard to the extinction of some other species. So we find it sad that certain animals either have gone extinct or that they are going extinct. But we need that I think is often just sentimentality. I understand it entirely. I think the world is less rich if we have less biodiversity. So there is that consideration, and it's I think largely a sentimental one. But I don't think it's misplaced to worry about how animals are going extinct. I think once they're extinct, there's a certain silver lining there. You know, it's good that there are no more members of that species. Good for potential beings of that species that there are no more of them.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't think that we should engage in this de-extinction, where some people want to try and bring animals back from extinction through various genetic means. I'd be opposed to that. Why introduce more beings that will suffer? But I am concerned about animals suffering on the way to extinction. And again, I think we're very poor calculators of what's going to produce better or less bad consequences. And so we should be doing the actions that on the face of it are good, and that on the face of it are non-harmful, without getting too distracted by these long and convoluted and highly contentious causal explanations.
Right, so I guess this could be called in philosophy. I just want to check that this is what you're applying here to a lot of the stuff that you've espoused during this podcast. Would a lot of your thinking come from what's called the principle of uncertainty, or the precautionary principle? So the idea that we're poor evaluators of what could happen, so we best err on the side of caution instead of arrogantly believing that we have all the answers and this would do this. The precautionary principle here would just be to say that we should just not procreate, because we simply can't judge just how creating a human life would essentially be a reckless gamble in this instance.
Well, it depends how you understand the precautionary principle and the idea of erring on the side of caution. I do think that probabilities count. And so there could be circumstances in which you can't be 100% sure of something, but you should proceed anyway, because not proceeding has very certain costs, whereas proceeding has only a low chance of a bad outcome. So I think there are circumstances of that kind. I just don't think that that's what we're dealing with in this kind of scenario. Okay. I mean, here's another analogy I've not presented. Let's imagine somebody in a more religiously intolerant period or place who believes they need to execute heretics in order to prevent those heretics from burning in hell for the rest of eternity. Let's imagine they've got some worldview whereby you can burn somebody here on earth and then they will be spared hell in the world to come. And so you engage in some kind of weird religious consequentialist argument whereby you're inflicting mass suffering on people now with a purported utilitarian goal of producing less bad in the long run. I just say you've got no entitlement to make that decision. It rests on highly contentious premises, with which many people would reasonably disagree, and just leave it be. It's not your business. You do what you meant to do, and if this other person burns in hell as a result, that's their business, not yours. And I similarly think that there's a limit to our authority over the world. We don't have godlike attributes. We're deeply flawed, fallible beings, and there is therefore a limitation on what we are obliged to do and not do as a result of that. And so you don't go around murdering people, and you don't go around murdering animals, and you don't go around clearing rainforests, all of which are harmful on the face of it, because you've got some account that in the long run this will do less harm.
And I've probably, maybe I've already kind of asked this question, but let's say you just hypothetically did know, what would be the problem with clearing rainforest then? If you just said, I do know for a fact, that's in the hypothetical, that
you have asked that question.
Yes. You might need to remind me what you said again, just because I can't remember kind of what.
Because now you're no longer imagining a hypothetical example for a human being, because no human being is going to be justified in thinking that.
Now
you're imagining a hypothetical example for God, and I would just say, okay, well, if there is a God and he's in that situation, then let him decide. But no human being is going to be in a condition where they can be supremely confident with justification of their own infallibility.
I guess a lot of your reasoning and stuff that you've talked about throughout this whole podcast has been a kind of perspective that I haven't seen that much used before, and that's just how poor judges are of everything that humans are. I mean, in Better Never to Have Been, you mention even that we're poor judges of our own lives, because that's one argument as well that natalists use. They might say, for example, well, if someone just does say, well, I love my life and I just adore my existence, like, what is there that you could say is wrong with that? Your answer to that would be surely that humans are just poor judges of their own lives. Would that be correct?
Yes, I think humans are poor judges, but again, it would make a difference to me whether we were speaking about euthanasia for this person or them procreating. So if it's their life and they're happy with it and they don't want to die, I'm not going to override them and say, well, I know better than you. I think it's better for you if you die. But if somebody wants to extrapolate from their own poor judgment about themselves to the case of the child that they would produce, and they want to say, well, I'm justified in creating this new being, then I think they can be wrong about that. Again, I'm not saying I'm going to interfere with them, but I think that their moral authority is completely different there than it would be when they're speaking about their own life.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that, you wouldn't say I'm going to override that, deep-seated desire you have to exist by killing you, right? But you are essentially, as an antinatalist, imposing on them the idea that goes against their own belief that it is better that they had not come into existence. So you argue in Better Never to Have Been that it is just better that we don't come into existence, even though we believe that, it's good to be alive. So I guess the question would be like, who are we as antinatalists to actually say to people who do say, which is the majority of people, no, I love the fact that I exist, I'm glad I was born. Who are we to actually say, actually, it is bad that you were born, even though you...
Lawrence, I actually want to hear your answer to that. Have you ever had a natalist say to you before that argument? It's like, well, you're not the antinatalist argument that we're poor judges of our own lives is flawed, because all you're doing is you're judging someone else's experience, and they're the only judge of their experience. How can you judge that? Like, let's say hypothetically, Lawrence, let's say I'm a natalist, Lawrence, and I say to you, well, who are you to say that it's better that I didn't exist? I'm telling you now, Lawrence, it's better that I do exist. It's good that I came into existence. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would just say to someone that the way I see it coming into existence is, well, first of all, there's obviously going to be all sorts of biases that someone is going to fall afoul of, like status quo bias. I don't know what this one is called, but when someone has gone through something to a sufficient degree where they won't cut their losses.
Sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah. So I mean, Benatar even describes it. Well, he I'll use the same analogy, but he uses it for something else. So you know, if I've actually lost my train of thought.
We're talking about, if I was to say to you, Lawrence, that it is better than I've come into existence, you're not a judge of my own life. Like, you can't even say that I'm a bad judge of my own life. Like, I am the only judge of my own life. I'm the authority on that. So it just sounds silly that you, as an antinatalist, say, actually, George, it isn't better that you came into existence. You think that it is, but it isn't. It's like, but these are my thoughts, and it's a benefit to me because I'm thinking that I have come into existence.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is, I wouldn't try to convince someone that their life is shit, because look, I think it was bad that they came into existence. But if they're here already and they are having a good life, you know, like, I want them to continue having their life in a good way, right? Now, obviously, that can get tricky because they can become so optimistic that they think, I'll bring someone else here. That then, you know, is an issue. But I don't want to try and convince someone that their life is shitter than it is, because that can lead people into a spiral, right? The way that I would approach it is just say to them, look, to say that you clearly have a decent life, you know, you're one of the winners. Many people don't have a decent life, let alone non-human animals. And, you know, good for you. You know, I don't want to make your life worse in any way. But just because your life is good and you're glad that you came into existence doesn't mean that your coming into existence was a good thing for you. So, for example, if you'd have never come into existence, you would simply not exist to regret not having come into existence. And if we look at, you know, the year 1400 or whatever, right? Neither me nor the person that is glad to be born existed back then. They didn't exist to give a flying fuck that they hadn't come into existence then. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, and in fact, we're glad we didn't exist then, because that would have been a horrible time to be alive.
Yeah, but it's just the fact that if someone is glad to have come into existence, that to me provides no that doesn't to me provide any sound basis for creating new people or justifying having created that person. It doesn't excuse the fact that their parents took a massive gamble on that person's behalf. They could have turned out a cancer patient. They may very well still, you know, turn out as a cancer patient. If someone comes to you and says, hey, look, my life is great, there's clearly selection bias there, right? The people who are having mediocre or bad lives don't generally come up to people and start advertising life. Do you get what I mean? Or being the salesperson of life. But also, that person may be having a good life now, but for many people, the very bad parts of life often accumulate at the end, right? And they may not have gotten to that point, or that by that point when they're you know, expressing their gladness to have been born. So there are many different things to take into consideration when someone says to you, yeah, I'm glad to have been born. But fundamentally, that just isn't an argument for creating people. It's simply just, it's what do you call it? It dampens the negative impact that it's going to have on someone. You know, I'd prefer people were happy given they exist than depressed.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just add one quick point before I carry on playing. Like, yeah, let's say hypothetically, factory farmed chickens in cages were glad they came into existence. I think you'd still have to be pretty crazy to say, well, then it is good that they came into existence. Like, we would just say, like, you're the it's almost like a form of Stockholm syndrome of your own mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's like your own mind is the captor that you're subservient to.
You know, it's actually interesting you use the term Stockholm syndrome, because I actually have a half-finished script called fuck, I can't remember the exact name. I can actually get it up, but it's it uses Stockholm syndrome. It's Stockholm syndrome, an antinatalist perspective on the glad to be born.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I've sort of like the stuff I was just saying there is sort of like a jumble of my thoughts, but like I've sort of properly written them down in that script. I don't know when the video will come out, but yeah.
Cool. All right, let's continue.
You don't even think that it was.
We're just like everybody else in the relevant way. So the crucial distinction is making a moral judgment that might differ from somebody else's, and then imposing your judgment on somebody else whose view differs from your own. And so I would say if somebody was born and is happy to have been born, you're mistaken to be happy that you were born. But it doesn't follow that I'm going to take them out of this world. And I might also say to somebody that you were mistaken in having a child, or you are mistaken in wanting to have a child, without it following that I must now go and prevent them from having a child.
But
so that's the crucial distinction.
But who are we to say that they're mistaken? On what basis do we say that they're making a mistake in judging that their own life is actually good?
Who are they to say that we are mistaken about these matters? It boils down to the arguments. So they can advance their arguments and we can advance our arguments. Right. And it may be that our arguments are better than theirs, or possibly that their arguments are better than ours. Yeah. And it's in part because we are fallible, that we could be wrong about this, that we should not impose our views on others in a physical way, coerce them to do things, force them to do things, or not to do things. But doesn't mean you're not entitled to a view. And the better justification you have for your view, the better a view it's likely to be.
Now, just going back to the wild animal stuff, one counter argument I guess I've had towards the natalist vegans who say, well, actually, George, your view as an anti-natalist is toxic to animal rights because there will actually be more animal suffering on the planet by more animals existing and blah, blah, blah. One counter argument to that I've had is, let's assume for the sake of the argument they are right, and there are more beings on this planet suffering as a result of anti-natalism, right? My counter argument to that has been this is just assuming hypothetically that they were right. Humans actually cause the highest intensity of suffering. I want to get your view on this. So we can actually objectively measure, because a lot of people don't think we can, but I think we can actually objectively measure levels of pain. And apparently the worst ways of dying on like the pain scale that there are is being boiled alive or burned alive, right? Now, humans are the only species who can actually do this. So humans do these horrific acts of abuse to animals, pouring petrol on them and setting them alight in these horrific snuff videos and stuff that go around on the internet. Humans are the only species that cage and torture animals and stuff like that. And chickens and pigs are routinely boiled alive in slaughterhouses, right? So there is the intensity of pain argument that humans actually cause a more intense pain than any other animal does. And that includes above, for example, hyenas who kill in the most horrific ways, right? They eat these animals guts out while they're alive. And, the natalist vegans would say, we need to be around to mitigate that or clear the most land space. But my counter argument to that has been that we cause actually a more intense form of suffering than any of those other animals do. What do you make of that argument of mine?
Before I get to that, can I just deal with some of the premises of your argument? So you've spoken about an animal rights view. Now, of course, you're speaking about an animal rights view in the technical sense. And you're speaking about a view that it's wrong to do certain things to animals, even if you produce better consequences by doing that. Yeah. So those vegans who are vegans on animal rights grounds, then we need to think about what the consequence is going to be. If you shouldn't do something to an animal, you shouldn't do something to an animal. It doesn't matter whether, as a result of that, there are going to be more wild animals suffering. So that's that's one important point. Now, in terms of quantifying the amount of suffering or the intensity of suffering, it's very hard to calculate this. I mean, how many animals in the wild are being eaten alive and over how long a period? And it's probably relatively few, because most of them probably die more quickly, but they don't die immediately when they're in the jaws of the predator. And so quantifying these things is going to be really difficult. I do think that humans inflict vast amounts of suffering, and not just in terms of quantity, but in terms of the intensity. Mm-hmm. If you think about the daily lives of farmed animals, it's a lot worse than the daily life of a wild animal. And I also don't know, when it comes to the chickens, how many, or the pigs, how many of them are being boiled alive. In theory, these animals should be stunned before they go into the scalding tanks. We know that doesn't always happen, but do we know the precise rates at which it doesn't happen? So these, again, are very complex calculations. And I think they're ones that we can bypass for all the reasons that I've been espousing in our discussion so far today. I think that certain things we shouldn't be doing, and this kind of long-term consequentialist argument is just not convincing.
Now, you've given me great ammo for another question that I'd really love to ask you, and I think my listeners as well.
So I guess we're going to go on to the predators bit now with Benatar. But I guess, do you have any summarizing thoughts about just the idea of human existence being a good thing, for animals?
I think I've pretty much said everything. I just think overall, I find it extremely hard to make hard and fast statements about the future in that way, especially when we're talking, because like we've got to be real. If we're talking about humans really intentionally going, which isn't this whole argument, because people are saying that humans passively reduce wild animal suffering as well, but if we also want to talk about humans going out of our way to help wild animals on a mass scale to the point where we can eventually eradicate wild animals, which is what people pushing this argument are saying, right? They eventually want to eradicate wild animals. This is going to be far, far into the future, to the point where we just completely, as Benatar said, overblow our confidence and our sense of agency in this. And that, for me, whilst I don't think that is a knockdown argument to this vegan natalist argument. I don't think there is a knockdown argument to this argument overall. It's just everything is so uncertain about the future that I don't think you can really make a knockdown argument either way. Like, at the end of the day, we don't know if humans are going to if humans did go extinct, whether in the long term it would be good or bad. Like you said, if humans do go extinct, wild animals reclaim the earth, horror ensues. But if humans continue, we're very likely going to go to other planets, and then you've got multiple planets with wild animals suffering on, right? So
yeah,
it's just I just find these things so hard to comprehend about possible futures that I always just come back to, what can I affect in the immediate now and make general good actions for the future as well. But trying to calculate all these things to a minutiae, to within an inch of your life or whatever, I don't know. For me, it's too complicated for me to be able to take into consideration with my actions.
Yeah, you're right. I think the people advancing these arguments, they're treating it like a game of chess, but they don't really understand what the next steps are going to be. And it's just pure optimism bias. They think that humans being around will create this magical technology that will solve all suffering and everything's going to be great. What if humans create sentient AI and AI just creates this I don't know, just absolute hellscape, and every human born, an animal born on this planet is tortured in a dungeon for all eternity or something. I mean, if anything, humans could just screw up everything and make a more infinite amount of suffering than we could ever imagine by being around. We don't know that. It's quite a terrifying thing. So I just say everyone should do their duty and end their family line now. To be honest, why take these ridiculous gambles because of some little dreamy utopian future that you might have in your head? Just be anti-natalist and be vegan always, and do the things now that prevent the most rights violations and suffering within your immediate power, rather than treating it like some kind of massive game of chess. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, no, it's just very quickly, so let's just say if you have a vegan couple and they're thinking about having a kid, right? And let's say there will be a higher chance that kid will be vegan than if the kid was born to two carnist parents, right? So let's say, and I think this is optimistic, but let's say there's only a 1 in 10 chance that their kid will end up being not vegan, right? I actually think there's probably a higher chance, but let's just say for the sake of argument, there's only a 1 in 10 chance their kid will be non-vegan. This is a 1 in 10 chance that their kid will kill like 2,000 or more animals in their life. When would you ever take that gamble in any other scenario? If someone came to you and said, I know for a fact, and this, this gets into the certainty that Benatar is even criticizing, but if someone says to you, I know for a fact that your kid has a 1 in 10 chance of being a mass murderer and they kill 2,000 or more humans in their life, who's going to take that gamble, right? Like, just if you are a sensible person that has a good head on your shoulders and you're empathetic, do as much with your actions that can do good in the world as possible. Help those who exist now. Try and do things that will generally help people or individuals who are coming into existence in the future. But creating someone else and trying to kick the can down the road for them doing these things, to me, it just seems like you think you have way more control over things than you actually do. And I think it does suffer from optimism as well. And again, like I said, I don't think that's a smackdown argument against what these vegan natalists are saying. I don't think there is either way. It's just a consideration. And I think it's one people should take, into account significantly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good analogy about if there was a 1 in 10 chance your kid could be a serial killer or whatever. And also, let's say there is a 9 out of 10 chance, hypothetically, your child will be vegan, which I doubt. I mean, that's just a ridiculously optimistic thing. Well, what about their kids and their kids and their kids and their kids and their kids? And like, there's just no. Like, the best thing to do is just end your family line now as soon as possible to stop any future oppressor from being born, basically.
Cool. So now it's going to go into the predator bit, right? So how much of the predator, because I know we've been going for basically 2 hours now, and I actually don't know how long you've got.
I could probably do like 20 minutes more. So maybe we could kind of just skim through the predator bit and give our thoughts. I don't know.
Round off and do some questions. Okay, cool. All right. Well, let's just do like 3-4 minutes of this predator bit, and then we can sort of round off and take some questions.
Cool. Yeah, I might even let me put the speed up a tiny bit.
Yeah, go on.
1.5.
Those animals would have been picked out earlier by predators.
Killing predators because it ultimately spares prey animals from the horrific suffering they would endure at their hands.
Yes, and I've written something about this, which will be published in due course.
Oh.
And my view is that that's, again, a misguided line of inquiry for the very reasons that I've been outlining so far. If you were to eliminate the predators, then you may in fact be increasing the amount of suffering, because the animals on which they prey would very likely increase in number. And not only would they increase in number, but they'd probably die even worse deaths, because they'd now start.
Okay, so here's one thing I wish I'd have pushed Benatar back on when he said this. The idea that we should... So for anyone wondering, just because I skimmed through a bit there, I now put to him this idea that we should kill... should we kill predator animals to spare prey animals from the horrific deaths they would face at their hands? Now, he mentions about that this could result in an increase in suffering because you'd then have overpopulation of prey animals and blah, blah, blah. But this is where sterilization could come in. I wish I could, I wish I'd remembered to say to him during this, when he said that, okay, so why don't we just kill the hyenas, say, but then sterilize the zebras, whatever.
Yeah, well, so I was actually going to bring this up when we got onto this topic. So whenever I hear about people talking about killing predators, the first thing that comes to mind is that this is just like such a bad topic to harp on about from a PR point of view. Like, why are people choosing this as the hill they're going to die on in the animal rights movement when, sure, even if you think that killing predators will do some good, there's loads of other things we can focus on that will also do loads of good, like ending factory farming and stuff like this. Why do we have to pick the thing that's super controversial when we can go for something like farming, which so many people would agree with? You know, there have been polls done where people probably don't really understand the implications of what they're voting for. But so many people say slaughterhouses should be shut down, right? And these are just everyday people. These are like clear wins we could make, in the relatively near future, maybe. Why are we picking these super controversial ones that like are just going to be so difficult to get people on side on? And even if we do, it's not clear that that's going to do more good than this other thing we could have focused on. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, like, I don't understand why people go straight for killing the predators. It seems like it would be less controversial when you could get people on board with using contraception, and in the long run it would have the same effect, right? You would not have those predators anymore if this is something we want to pursue. Now, someone could say, oh, well, if you use contraception, there's still going to be predators around in the immediate and they're going to be killing animals. But let's be honest, this is not something that we're going to be able to solve like that. Whatever like solution we take to predation, it's going to be drawn out and take time. So we might as well pursue the less controversial option of contraception, which also doesn't encourage us to resort to killing as a solution to things, right?
But you see, Lawrence, this is not what you'd say to the xenomorph analogy. Yes, we will sterilize the xenomorph to stop them from killing Lawrence's, to stop their, after they've killed Lawrence and his family, well, at least they won't have any offspring who could kill.
Yeah. So, well, this is the thing. So, and I think Benatar. No, it's all good. I think Benatar even addresses this. The xenomorph thought experiment, whilst I understand the point it's trying to make, it also doesn't directly map onto reality, right? So, if there was just one xenomorph or a collection of xenomorphs that had come to Earth and started killing people, then I agree, killing them is a solution, right? But if they're endemic to the world and there's loads of them everywhere, and this has been something that's been going on for millions and millions of years, and we don't have the technological capacity to actually kill them all at the moment, then and also it would be controversial to kill them, because let's be real, if we were to map this onto reality, xenomorphs would be put on a pedestal by humans. Look how humans idolize lions, right? So if we were to directly map this onto reality, people would be lionizing, guess where that word comes from? Xenomorphs, right? So it seems like if we were to actually directly map it onto reality, contraception seems like a more practical way forward than killing predators, if getting rid of predation is something that you want to do. Which, hey, look, I'm in favor of there not being any predators anymore. How we get there is a separate conversation. And I think I'm more in favor of on the side of contraception than killing these predators for a variety of reasons, and I've just outlined some of them there. But
shall we play any more of the predator bit, or should we just open on Q&A?
I think we can open up, because I think we've sort of gone over it a bit there, and he's not, unless you think there's specific bits you want to go over. If you have any general thoughts, but we can go to questions.
Yeah, my only bit that I guess I wish I would have pushed Benatar a bit more. Obviously, I'm going to wait for his work that he writes about this, but I would have wish I could have pushed him like on the contraception point, because I didn't think about that during the discussion. And then towards the end, he says that if someone, say in the UK, is a vegan and they already have a boa constrictor in their care that they bought from a pet shop from their non-vegan days, he says we should repatriate the boa constrictor. So,
when he says that, does he mean put it in the just release it into the wild?
Yes, but to the actual ecosystem that they're originally from. So,
oh right, I got
so not in the UK, for example.
Yeah, not in Kent.
Yeah, right. I wish I'd have just pressed him more on the fact that boa constrictor will then go on to squeeze animals to death. And is he really okay? Why should he not just kill the boa constrictor, for example, in that sense? This isn't screwing up the ecosystem. This was a bred boa constrictor. The boa constrictor has been bred by humans. They're not a part of the ecosystem, anything like that. It's not going to screw up the ecosystem in any way, you killing this boa constrictor. It's just going to spare, A, the mice from being bred who are murdered for this boa constrictor, and B, these animals who would be squeezed to death in the ecosystem when you repatriate them. Like, what I wish I'd have just pressed him, like, why would you not kill that boa constrictor, just to hear his ethical argumentation for that, because that is, you know, a philosophically tricky one. Because there's no vegan solution to this. You either murder an animal in your care, you murder countless animals for the animal in your care, or you release this animal in your care so they can go on and murder a load of innocent animals. So it's like, what the fuck is the solution to this?
It's a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Yeah. So if people want to get their questions in the chat, just put question in capitals and then your actual question, and we'll get to them. But whilst people are submitting their questions, what are your general thoughts overall coming out of the Benatar interview? Because I think at the very start of the stream, you said that you wanted to talk about your thoughts before and after having spoken to him. I don't know if your thoughts have changed on anything since then.
Yeah, I think talking to him maybe even further solidified my views that it's not that antinatalism and veganism are very compatible, and that it's not some kind of hypocrisy, you know, to be antinatalist and vegan. I think he could quite convincingly argue to anyone that, you know, human existence ultimately is a bad thing on this planet for animals. And I don't think in fact, I didn't even mention at any point in the podcast the points that I'd raised with you about the fact that we could stop a potential astrological disaster as humans, which would be against what I want. I want astrological disaster, that humans would migrate life to other planets just to oppress life on those planets, bring factory farms with them to Mars, so to speak. So yeah, I think he just helped solidify my views, and he you know, quite convincingly taught me more about the fallibility of humans and stuff. So it was great to pick his brains on all this kind of stuff and just hear what he would say. I'm looking forward to his predator thing, because I do think that is a very tough one when we talk about, well, what if we sterilize the herbivores so that they can't overpopulate, and you're just doing the job that the predators might do. Though his counter to that actually might be that predators pick off usually the weak and sickly herbivores or something like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. And I think I've pretty much said all I want to say, to be honest. The only other thing that I guess I'd add is just that, as you were saying before, the wildlife that, if this is something we want to pursue, the wildlife that we can push back may be replaced by animal farming or intensive animal farming. And it's actually changing shape at the moment. So one thing that's becoming more common is the factory farming of insects.
Yeah.
Now, the sentience of insects and how much pain they can feel is still something being researched, but there seems to be like convincing evidence that at least some insects can feel pain. And actually, many of the proponents of this vegan natalist argument I've heard actually often draw attention to insects, because the overwhelming majority of sentient beings that would be displaced, I believe, would be insects if they in fact are sentient, which I think they probably are, at least some of them. But we're now starting to factory farm insects, and that could be ramped up massively. So we could be clearing some land just to then bring, and if humans expand into that land, then those humans are going to obviously need more food. So there's going to be more factory farms. And if they're a factory farm of insects, then, I mean, how many insects can you fit in a farm? Like trillions and trillions and trillions. So Yeah, I just thought that's another consideration. But anyway, let's get to some questions. So the first one I've got is here from Cami. So Cami asks, one thing I struggle with is forced sterilization of animals. On intuition, it feels morally permissible, but I still don't want to be speciesist, and on intuition, it feels impermissible with humans. What do you think about that? So basically, it's like we have to be consistent here. Either it's okay to sterilize forcefully or it's not.
Yeah, you're right. There has to be some kind of distinction that makes it socially, because yeah, for sure. With humans, you'd say it's authoritarian in this case if we did it for humans, but then we're making that judgment for animals.
I could say one thing. So one person who has actually spoken about this is Magnus Vinding. He actually has a small booklet which you can find for free online called The Speciesism of Leaving Nature Alone, the Theoretical Case for Wildlife Antinatalism, or something like that. And he actually talks about this in his book. Or it's more like a booklet because it's relatively short, an essay. But now I'm probably going to butcher it, but essentially what he says is if humans had as bad a life as wild animals have, because we've got to remember that the majority of wild animals live very short and brutal lives, and we actually misjudge this because the wild animals we tend to focus on are the big ones that reproduce like us. So they have a few number of offspring that they put attention into rather than loads of offspring, like a frog, for example, but most of them die very quickly, right? Either of hunger or predation or exposure to the environment. So he was saying if we actually lived in a world where the vast majority of humans died in often horrible ways, then actually we probably wouldn't need to convince most people not to reproduce, because people would see how bad the situation is. Now,
I just want to push back on that.
Yeah, well, I was also gonna, yeah.
Go on, you say your bit, and then I will.
No, I was just going to say, but you could also think people did still reproduce in places like Auschwitz and stuff like this. And
right.
Also,
yeah, humans just do it. Looking in Gaza right now, they're having kids. Like, what the fuck is with that? Why do people in war zones have kids? I've been called every name under the sun for this. I recently posted about this on X. You know, should people in war zones be having kids? And people, how dare you? What? You're just telling them to wave the white flag and just to give up on the genocide or whatever it is. It's like you can't just you can't just use kids as pawns in a game to get like the political thing you want. Oh, my country is under attack. I'm going to have a kid. I'm sorry, that's just an act of child abuse.
Yeah, you can be a victim and a perpetrator, right? Like you can be a victim of a genocide, but also be a perpetrator by bringing another victim into it, right?
Right.
So, yeah. So I get what you mean. What Magnus also says is that often when people think about forced sterilization in wild animals and in the circumstances of humans, we're actually not making a direct comparison because the situations are different, right? So if we were to truly have similar situations, these would be humans with poor quality lives, where if they reproduce, the vast majority of the offspring die in often horrible ways. But also these humans are essentially mentally retarded to the point where they can't make any rational decisions on an ethical level, right? And he says that actually in that case, it may very well be justified to intervene and put some sort of contraception in, like without asking these individuals, because they have literally no way of making the decision themselves. And we know that if they do reproduce, it would cause an untold number of amount of suffering, if you get what I mean. And
the problem is,
I can link his essay in the thing.
Yeah, but okay. I mean, people are still doing, though, in our mind, a dumb thing by having kids. So I mean, who cares if they have the mental faculty to make the decision or whatever? The point is they're not doing it. So that's just the one thing I would push back on. Yeah, okay, humans are more
Right, okay,
intelligent,
I get
and
what you mean.
we can philosophize about these things, but they just choose not to, or they say, "Yeah, you know, good point. Antinatalists are right, but I'm just going to have a kid anyway." So it's like what?
Yeah,
There's still
yeah.
no real distinction. Like, still, it seems kind of unfair to violate maybe the deer's bodily autonomy, but then the human. I don't know. It'd be like. Yeah, that's a strange one. Could there not be an argument that humans are more deserving of being sterilized because they're choosing? They have the ability to philosophize about this and the pain that it will cause, yet they actually choose to do it. So it's like you deserve to be sterilized for your because of the fact that you're actually choosing to create suffering, whereas an animal can't think about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, I don't know if I can come up. I don't know if I'll be accused of just being arbitrary, but for me, it feels very different to sterilize without consulting a moral patient who can't make decisions for themselves, as opposed to a moral agent who can make decisions for themselves.
Yeah. Because a deer wouldn't be like, you bastards, you violated my bodily
they'd be
autonomy.
none the
They just
wiser.
wouldn't
They
know.
wouldn't know.
Yeah,
they
would
wouldn't
just
know.
go around. Yeah, they'd be having sex and stuff, but just nothing.
Yeah,
happening.
but just nothing would result. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and also you know, I mean, this is anyway. But it's like, you know, when we say if you neuter or spay a cat or a dog, like they're none the wiser in the grand scheme of things. Whereas with humans, if you're trying to run around with a fucking tool, whatever they use to do vasectomies, it's going to be a very different story, isn't it? Probably get shot by the police.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Let's. Have you seen any that you want to get to? There's another one from Cami here. So this one is one thing I struggle. Oh wait, that's the same one.
We got one from CDA here. About would I debate Roger Yates?
Oh, where's that?
Question 9:06
Oh yeah,
PM.
I see that. Yeah.
Yes, I would definitely debate Roger Yates on intersectionality. Roger, if you're watching, let's do it. Or any intersectional who wants to debate me on intersectionality, I would gladly do that. If anyone is wondering, by the way, I had a great debate with Catherine Klein on intersectionality. It's on Debug Your Brains channel. Really, really good conversation. Nice, lively debate. Lots of back and forth between us two. And yeah, I think I'm like happy with the stuff I said in that debate as well. I think I held down my thoughts pretty well, and I think I would like to think I'd put forward a convincing argument as to why intersectionality is a bad thing. But
yeah, we've got one from Zen Ape, and Zen says if human interference causes a collapse of the biosphere, then do you think we could be within a generation of the end of nature?
I don't.
No, I don't think so. Even if a biosphere collapses, that, you know, I mean, the first thing I want to say is I'm not encouraging anyone to actually pursue this. But if someone was to pursue an end of nature, you would need to completely eradicate all aspects of life, right? We've got to remember that life started as I think it started as RNA or something like that, right? And then it developed into DNA, and then it developed into organisms, blah, 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 blah. So it's always going to come back. Even just a collapsing biosphere, like there have been mass extinctions in the past where like 97% of all life was wiped out, and it still came back to what it is today, right? So I don't think so, but I don't know if you have anything to add, George.
Yeah, I'm not well versed enough on ecology, I don't think, to be able to give a convincing enough opinion on that one. So I'm not going to commit what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect and start confidently talking about something I just don't know anything about.
Right, I did see we had another. Okay, we've got another question here. So from Mark, will George interview any other antinatalist philosophers in the near future?
So I like to keep my podcasts a bit varied in terms of who I have on. So I haven't got plans for one yet, especially not a philosopher now that I've had Benatar on. But there's definitely anti-natalist vegans I would love to get on the podcast or on live streams and stuff and talk about anti-natalism and veganism or whatever it is. I'd love to get Amanda on, for example. So I'll get Amanda on sometime for sure. I was honored to be on her podcast because I listened to it. So yeah, I'll get Amanda on sometime if you want to count Amanda as a philosopher. I don't know.
Well, that was the last one, unless I've missed any. If anyone has any last minute questions, whack them in now or forever hold your peace. But yeah, I guess we can quickly do closing thoughts if you have any. I mean, to be honest, I think I've said pretty much everything I wanted to say.
Yeah. I will. I'll give one more closing thought, which is just one other thing I wish I'd pushed Benatar on right at the end of the podcast. He says at the end, but overall, have we decreased the suffering or increased the suffering as a result of human existence, in the world? He said, definitely increased it. And I just said, great way to end the podcast, blah, blah, blah. But what I should have said is maybe, but you've said that humans are terrible at making such calculations. So how can you now make that calculation that humans have definitely increased the suffering in the world? Yeah. So I'm wondering what I could say to what authority do you, Dr. Benatar, think you are to make such a calculation? So I wish I'd have pushed him on that little bit. But it does seem, at least from the intensity of suffering perspective, I would just say for sure we've increased it, because every single thing that wild animals do in nature, we just do that as well to animals. Like every single horrific video you could watch in nature, humans do those things and even worse. So from that perspective, I just think it's inarguable. Like it's objective that when it comes to like the most pain, torture and stuff like that, humans are the species who have done the most of that on this planet.
We've actually had one last question, so we'll make this the last question. We've had one last one come in, and actually it's about, do you know David Pearce, George?
Yes, I do know of him. We follow each other on X. Then again, he follows everyone on there, so I don't know if that's some kind of claim. He follows like 100,000 people or something. So maybe I could get him on sometime.
Yeah, I was going to say he'd be an interesting person. Yeah, transhumanism and veganism. Okay. But anyway, so Cami asks thoughts on techno-optimism, David Pearce, transhumanist utopia. They say that they think it's cope. 5 out of 7 humans lack anesthesia. I doubt on bliss machine, Neuralink fantasies. But so basically the question is, do you think this idea of transhumanism and, trying to expand human capacities beyond our natural means via, genome editing and technology, is this just complete techno-optimism, or do you think that it is maybe a viable way forward for making the world a better place?
Well, technically, all technological innovation is techno-optimism. So if we can do it, yeah, sure. Why not? Let's try and aim towards that. But I think we should also promote anti-natalism and veganism on the way to it. Let's do all three things. So let's promote technological innovation or techno-optimism, if you want to call it that. I mean, the design of our laptops that we're speaking on here was techno-optimism, right? It was this idea, you imagine one day these two guys, Lawrence and George in the UK, they're going to be looking at each other, but they're going to be in completely different rooms. It's a load of optimism. There it is. It's happened, right? So all technological innovation is techno-optimism. So I say, yeah, it's great that David Pearce wants to head towards that kind of future. But at the same time, we should also not procreate and also be vegan. I would just say on top of that.
Yeah, I would agree. So I think, we should continue to be vegan. Don't bring anyone else here. And if there are places where we can use technology to make coming into existence slightly less of a harm, then we should do that, but with all the sort of due caution. Like, obviously, I understand, I completely understand, and I have the same reservations about you know, bringing about technologies where you can completely transform humans, either technologically or through genome editing. Because, you know, what if, you know, some sort of dictator gets hold of that, you know, uses that to build some sort of, you know, superhuman army or whatever. You know, it seems like a technology that in the hands of people who have, you know, in the hands of good people, yeah, it could do a lot of good, but equally in the hands of bad people, that could do a hell of a lot of bad.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be cautious about.
Yeah, because think of all the technology we've created for the worse. We've created
exactly. Yeah.
Devices of torture and death, for example. So
yeah, and like, yeah, you know, nuclear fission, you get energy, but you also get nuclear bombs, right? So it's like,
yeah,
each of these technologies can be used for good and bad.
Hiroshima was a feat of technological brilliance. You know, I mean, wow, whoever designed this nuke, you know, is extremely innovative, and wow, a lot of human genius went into it. But then there it was to cause the murder and suffering and you know, burning of thousands of humans and animals in a space. It just shows that technology can be horrific as much as it can be brilliant.
Yeah, 100%. Cool. I reckon we can leave it there. Do you have anything you want to say or anything you want to plug before we finish? Obviously, I'll link your channel in the and website in the description once this is done. But yeah, it's just
cool. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for watching, everyone. And we've got one more question here, Lawrence. Shall we ask
okay, go on then.
Vegan Bambi.
All right, so do you believe traits are passed down? If so, then only the less empathetic people will procreate and the world will end up with more suffering.
Yeah, no, I don't believe that. I mean, it's true to a certain extent, but then our whole family is like millions of people before us and all these different variations of traits that get passed down. The idea that vegans have this kind of compassionate gene or something like that is a load of nonsense. You could create the most evil person in the world, and the most evil person in the world could create the most kind person in the world. There's no kind of like everyone will probably have a relative somewhere who they know of who's like a scumbag, and then vice versa. There could be a family of scummy people, and they have like you know, this child prodigy who's trying to change the world for the better or whatever. And so yeah, no, I think this just plays into this whole optimism bias stuff, and it just doesn't scientifically make sense either, because we're all massive. The gene pool is so varied. We take after our parents like in looks only. We don't, like, you know, if I have a kid, they're not going to inherit like my ideas about anything. They're just going to be a completely different person to me. We can use our own parents as markers of this. Most people here in the comments section are vegan, but no one's parents here will be vegan. Your kid might not be vegan. Your parents have completely different views on you about everything. You might think they have terribly unethical views about a whole host of subjects.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just like, yeah, I mean, it's obviously true that parents pass certain things down to a certain extent in genes. How much, you know, of their sort of empathetic disposition is passed down, I don't know. Is it a sufficient amount to make an overwhelming case about antinatalism? I suspect not. But you know, if a vegan wants to create more vegans and pass down empathy, it seems to me better to adopt someone who's likely not vegan. Then you can turn someone who already exists vegan, rather than just creating another vegan, and all the meat eaters are still out there. So then you've replaced the meat eater with a vegan, and you can pass on empathy and good values that way. It's just because they're not your kid doesn't mean they're going to be impenetrable to vegan values, especially if you raise them with vegan values from a very early age.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I guess that's what I'd say. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, I guess the only thing left to say is just thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for doing the interview with Benatar as well, because it was interesting to see a discussion on that topic. yeah, that's it from me. Thanks so much for everyone watching. Did you want to plug anything, George, or are you happy to finish?
Yeah, I've got a live stream coming up this weekend with MC Ronan, who was the author whose talk got gate crashed recently at a vegan conference. I think it was in Melbourne. So if anyone wants to tune into my live stream this weekend on that, please do. It should be interesting. So that's the next thing that you can see coming up on my channel, I guess. And yeah. Oh, and yeah, if you like my content or you have any more questions for me, folks, best way to hit me up is it's probably on Instagram these days. Actually, I spend a lot of time on Instagram, so just Carnism_debunked on Instagram, and yeah, feel free to DM me anything you want, or yeah, check out my content over there.
And Instagram is another example of techno-optimism. They thought it would improve our lives, but look at the state it's put us in.
Especially Lawrence. All right.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, cheers everyone for watching, and we'll both see you in the next one.
See you later, folks.